Keep your guard up for those who claim that they are following science when really what they're following is scientism. Christians do not object to science. In fact, we believe that Christianity gives us a basis for conducting the scientific endeavor. However, we do object to scientism, the idea that the only route to knowledge or the best route to knowledge is through some set scientific method. Welcome to Christ or Chaos, a ministry of Village Church in association with Converge Podcast. I'm Chris Bolt, and today we are asking this question: is there any genetic evidence for evolution? There are a host of assumptions that go into the entire discussion about biological evolution. Sometimes evolutionists will come to you and they will think that you have misunderstood evolution along the lines of the distinctions between belief and theory and fact, this sort of thing. All of these pertain in some sense to knowledge and to the scientific endeavor and how evolution plays out through those. What exactly is evolution? Well, evolution is, at the very least, a belief. If a person claims to have knowledge of evolutionary theory or claims to have knowledge of evolutionary fact, knowledge is made up of belief. That's a component of knowledge. And so a person who claims to know things regarding evolution at least has belief. There's also justification or warrant there, and there would also be truth there if, in fact, evolution is true knowledge. And so don't get too hung up on these discussions of what's called the epistemology, that is, what can we know and how can we know it, the epistemology of evolution in that sense. We're not saying on the podcast episode today that evolution is just a theory, and so we can hand wave all of the supposed evidences in its favor and that sort of thing. We can grant, for the sake of argument, that there's some type of knowledge claim here pertaining to evolution and the supposed facts of evolution without going into a rhetorical trick of, well, it's just a theory. Other evolutionists will say, well, you're uneducated about these things. Well, generally speaking, we are all following some sort of testimonial model of knowledge here, or knowing, when it comes to evolutionary biology. Most people are not evolutionary biologists. That is a subset of the population as a whole. And so when people come to you and pretend as though they know much more than you do about evolution and the things that they want to talk about, understand that they have read a book or looked at some sort of pictures or seen a movie or documentary on what they believe is scientific fact. They are simply receiving or accepting a testimony to evolution from some other person or from other people. Also, this is just a form of what's called ad hominem, an argument to the man, when an evolutionist replies to your arguments and says, well, you're just uneducated about these sorts of things. Of course, I'm using a fallacy of sorts here. It's called a tu quoque, a you-too fallacy. I'm saying, really, we're all on a level playing field. Not all of us, but most of us are on a level playing field when it comes to talking about the theory of evolution in terms of our education and understanding of it. Most people are not in the laboratory actually conducting these experiments. We're reading reports and whatnot about them. It's also the case that most people who interact with you on this topic don't know your level of education anyway. That having been said, I do have some education regarding the philosophy of science in particular, which much of this discussion revolves around. Another objection you'll get when you're responding to an evolutionist on something like today's topic, genetic evidence or supposed genetic evidence for evolution, one of the objections you'll get is that you simply don't understand. I had someone on the internet tell me that I did not understand evolution, and that person then linked me to an article that consisted of nothing more than hand-drawn pictures of supposed transitions that happened in evolutionary history. In other words, he was claiming that I did not understand evolution while then sending me a picture book about the topic, as though this is the evidence that he he had learned evolution from. I would say that I was not very convinced by that move. This, again, though, is a form of ad hominem or ad hom argumentation. It is fallacious reasoning, this idea, well, you just don't understand. Let the person explain for you with great specificity what exactly it is that you supposedly don't understand with evolutionary theory, because this is a type of hand-waving that evolutionists use to move the discussion off focus. By the way, something I'm going to do an episode on at some point in the future with regard to apologetic methodology or how to defend the Christian faith is this. About 90% of apologetics, I'd say, that's just a made-up statistic though, but about 90% of apologetics is keeping the person you're interacting with on topic, focused on what the actual discussion is, instead of trying to divert attention away from it and dodging questions and that sort of thing. There are also evolutionists who believe that there are such things as brute facts, that when we look at the items in nature, the data that's there, the data just speaks for itself. Nothing could be further from the truth. Evidence does not just speak for itself. There are no such things as brute facts. Everyone brings assumptions, presuppositions, background beliefs to the various evidences and facts and data that we find in the world around us. We then interpret those evidences through those assumptions, and then from those hard evidences, we draw inferences that either confirm or refute those assumptions that we brought, and sometimes people choose to hang on to the assumptions rather than follow the evidence where it leads through those inferences to solid conclusions. So there's a lot more going on with scientific reasoning than what people are usually willing to admit. We're going to focus a little bit more upon those assumptions and inferences momentarily, but this features prominently in the discussion about evolutionary biology. It's not as simple as someone stating a list of facts, and then those are supposed to speak for themselves concerning whether or not evolution is actually true or actually happened in history and, scientifically speaking, in nature. What we're looking at and what we're working with are assumptions behind all of that evidence and how it's interpreted through these inferences. You'll have a set of evidences, for example, and then inferences that are drawn to then fill out the very assumptions the person began with. I'm going to give you some specific, at least one specific example of that momentarily. There are also those who claim that you're going against scientific consensus. I have come across many people who believe or express that they know that the theory of evolution is fact and is true. And these people will say, how dare you go against this scientific consensus? I'm sure the scientists know better than you. I'm sure they've thought about these things before and that sort of thing. Well, this actually serves to undermine the entirety of scientific inquiry in the first place. Science does not just become established and then it's written in stone. We know this because you can look through history and there are actual scientific advancements. There is scientific progression throughout human history. And so if scientists have been wrong and the scientific consensus has been wrong in the past, the proper inference is to say, well then, the scientific consensus of today can also be wrong. And the way we come to know that the scientific consensus is wrong is through various things like questioning assumptions that go into our interpretation of the facts and questioning the inferences that we're drawing from those empirical evidences. Empirical meaning that it's something we come to through the five senses. And so we don't want to beg the question here or assume the very thing that we're setting out to prove as though that's the sum and substance of science. There are others then who will say to you that science is the only route to knowledge. The only way you can know anything is through science. Now, there's a big problem with that claim. How do you know the truth of that claim scientifically or through science? Let's say that there's an actual scientific method that is the established scientific method. That's a whole different topic for another day too, whether or not there is such a thing. But let's say that the scientific method itself is a set thing. How would you ever know then that the scientific method is the only route to knowledge. You would have to test that claim through using the scientific method. You cannot do that, categorically speaking. And so we know that the claim that the only route to knowledge is through the scientific method, we know that that claim in and of itself is false. It has a self-referential difficulty that shows us that you can't actually consistently utter that claim. Now, some people recognize this, and so they pull back and they say, well, it's not that science is the only route to knowledge. It's just that science is the best route to knowledge. But this, again, is just an assumption that has a self-referential problem, because how would we ever test scientifically that science is the best route to knowledge? And so the same problem represents itself when we try to weaken the claim that science is the best route to knowledge. This is what philosophers refer to as scientism. Scientism is really a type of religion that's fairly alive and well in our society today, and I would just plead with you to beware of that. Keep your guard up for those who claim that they are following science when really what they're following is scientism. Christians do not object to science. In fact, we believe that Christianity gives us a basis for conducting the scientific endeavor. However, we do object to scientism, the idea that the only route to knowledge or the best route to knowledge is through some set scientific method. That's simply not true. We know all sorts of other things. We have other routes to knowledge that don't come through the scientific method itself, which again, in and of itself, the scientific method cannot be propped up by itself. It must rely upon other assumptions that we bring to it. Another assumption that underlies many of the evolutionist claims is what's known as naturalism. Now, there are, generally speaking, two types of naturalism. There's methodological naturalism, and there's metaphysical naturalism. Methodological naturalism, the first type I just mentioned, is this assumption, for the sake of argument, that everything around us has some type of natural cause, that everything can be explained naturally. And so there's no what we might call supernatural cause or circumstance that comes into the equation. This is based then really upon assumption that metaphysical naturalism is true. Metaphysical meaning that in the case of the world itself, the universe we find ourselves in, the only causes we know of are natural causes. The only explanations we can come up with for anything that are rationally warranted are grounded in nature itself. There's nothing outside of nature. Now, there are a whole host of arguments that demonstrate serious difficulties with what we would call metaphysical naturalism, and many of these pertain then also to what I've called here methodological naturalism. But I just throw this out there to say that the evolutionary assumption for everyone other than, let's say, theistic evolutionists and other derivatives of that in other faulty, false world religions and cults, the working assumption for them is this methodological naturalism or metaphysical naturalism, or both, that cannot in and of themselves really be proven. They're simply assumed. And so that's a problem as well, and it shows you the assumptions that scientists or others are approaching the evidence with, and it puts them into this box that they cannot get out of to see some of the other potential explanations that could be there concerning the evidence that we're actually looking at that either supposedly confirms or would actually go against evolutionary theory. I want to make one more distinction here before we talk about something very specific, namely genetic evidence, so-called, for evolution. One particular example of that. This is a very broad topic, and we'll come back to this, Lord willing, on other podcast episodes here at Christ or Chaos. But I want to talk about evolution in terms of what scientists construct, and then evolution as it actually appears in the evidence. That's just simply a distinction that we're going to need to understand the evidence we're looking at here, following up on these other points that I've raised just now at the beginning of this episode. In other words, you could talk about evolution in the sense of a knowledge of what scientists have described, they say, about the universe, the world around us, the evidence that's there. You're talking about science then there in terms of scientific consensus or the supposed knowledge or the knowledge claims that the scientific community makes. We're asking if those types of claims actually pertain to the reality that they claim they are describing. And so that's a distinction we need to keep in mind. For example, today we'll look at a distinction between a constructed genome versus an actual genome that exists in reality. In other words, what scientists think epistemologically in terms of knowledge, their description, versus what is actually taking place in the world in terms of the actual hard evidence, the actual genome that the scientists are trying to get at through that knowledge. Just because something exists a particular way in the world doesn't mean we can actually get at it through our scientific knowledge. That's why we have errors in science oftentimes. Well, there is this argument that people will throw out when you ask for evidence for evolution. Is there any evidence at all for this thing called evolution? They'll sometimes appeal to the fossil record and say, well, we have these similarities between different fossils from different species. And so what they do is they take that supposed evidence and then draw this inference that therefore there must be a common ancestor. So there's a common descent, let's say, from or with chimpanzees and humans from another ancestor that was further back in the evolutionary line. Okay, so this is a colloquial way to put the issue to try to make it clear for you. So what we're talking about today is not those fossil evidences that are found in the soil. What we're talking about today is something like molecular fossils, you might call them. In other words, one of the things that evolutionists will raise to you as supposed evidence that evolution really did take place are these molecular similarities or DNA or genetic similarities between, let's say, for the sake of argument today, between humans and chimpanzees. And they'll say, aha, there is this similarity, there are these similarities between a chimp's DNA and human DNA, and so they draw this inference from that and say, well, then they must have had a common ancestor. There was common descent along chimp lines and human lines. Well, is this true? And what they'll say then, they'll make an analogy and say, don't you understand that we can determine genealogy today through DNA this way? We know who your ancestors are by looking at DNA, by these collections of DNA. And so we can, through DNA evidence, put people, at a particular place in a crime and all of that. I'm not going to call all DNA evidence into question today or something like that, although there are people out there who do delve into those sorts of things as well. What I am going to do today is simply raise the question, what assumptions have we brought to this supposed genetic evidence, and what inferences are we then drawing from that are clearly inferences and not themselves actual evidence? Does the actual evidence we have lead us to only draw those inferences for the sake of evolutionary theory? Now, I want to point out that this analogy with DNA evidence for genealogical records is not perfectly analogous. Otherwise, we'd just be simply talking about the same thing. The whole point of the analogy there is that there's a distinction between determining a genealogical line and determining a common ancestor in an evolutionary history. The one, genealogy, is much more localized. It is closer to us in terms of evolutionary time. I'm talking in terms of the evolutionist framework here and understanding of history. So genealogical genetic evidence is closer to us in terms of time, and it's more localized. There are more genetic similarities on a much more fine-grained level. And so that is clearly distinct then from talking about things that supposedly happened millions of years ago in a different species that is only distantly related to us. And even though there are supposedly similarities there are broad differences as well. So even offering this analogy, it does not establish what the evolutionist wants to establish because there are such distinctions and differences there in the analogy itself. In other words, just offering the analogy shows us that we're talking about two different things there. Saying, oh, there's genealogical evidence through genetics does not establish evolutionary theory. So don't fall for that one. The analogy fails. So let's talk about this supposed evidence, these supposed genetic similarities between humans and chimpanzees, these supposed molecular level fossils that we have. How exactly do we get this information anyway? Well, scientists begin looking at DNA and they try to figure out what's called a read. They have to have a read on the genetic evidence. And a read is simply a little snapshot, a little snippet or clip of the DNA as a whole. Never does a scientist see all of the DNA evidence, the whole picture of the DNA at one time. And so what the scientists have to do is they have to produce actual billions of these reads on the DNA evidence. But after they've produced all of these reads, these snippets, these snapshots, these clips of the DNA evidence, they have to then put them all back together, and they're trying to put them together in such a way that they make sense and tell the scientists something about what's going on with the DNA. And the way that they do this, because one scientist certainly can't do it all, not even a group of scientists can do it all, the way that they do this, they're already working off the work that was previously done by different scientists in other organizations at other times with other technologies and all of that. And so all of the current work is obviously based off previous work. And so we're not looking at something as simple as just, oh, you can look at the chimp's DNA and you can look at the human's DNA and you can compare the two the way that you might look at some twins and say, well, they look a lot alike with the bare eye. You can't do that when it comes to this supposed DNA evidence. Now, with chimpanzees, people mostly didn't care. If you think about this, you have to not only have one scientist who's properly funded in a laboratory with extraordinarily expensive resources and facilities and equipment and tools and education and experience. You don't just have to have one scientist that has all of those things. You have to have many multiple groups of scientists with all of those things who know what they're doing to come and to look at this evidence for chimpanzees, which means that you have to have some people who are really interested in that sort of thing. And frankly, there just aren't a lot of people who are interested in mapping out what's going on in chimpanzee DNA. And so from the get-go, this type of work that scientists would do to try to map out and determine chimpanzee genomes and DNA and all of that, they are without the resources that they really need. They are without the funding that they really need in many instances. And so they're working already uphill. By the way, none of this is a bad thing that we use science to look at these sorts of things. I'm just pointing out that it's nowhere near as simple, as easy as people suppose that it is. A lot of work, a lot of time, a lot of resources and funding had to go into this. And the poorer that is, the more poor in general will be the results of that research. It's not just that the scientists then have this extreme uphill battle in trying to determine this information. It's also that they have to work off previous work, and here's the kicker, scientists have to use some other type of mapping, some other type of genome for a reference point to do their work when it comes to studying the chimpanzee. So what do you think that scientists use to study the chimpanzee's genetic makeup and DNA and that sort of thing? Well, scientists use the human genome for a reference point or a framework when it came to this work. So just to reiterate, it's not as though we already have all of this resequenced uh, genome work done. We don't have completed large genomes that are end to end, and we understand all the complexities, exactly how they work, and we can trust that evidence to be reliable and that our interpretation of it is reliable. That's not what we have. In fact, most of that work was done with very simple organisms, with plants and with some small organisms, simple organisms. The simpler, the better. It's cheaper, it's easier to understand. That's not what we have when it comes to the chimps. Scientists are actually using this assumption of the framework of the human genome when they come to studying genetics with chimpanzees. So, to determine the entire DNA sequence in this genome, or we might say in a cell, there are chromosomes, and that's what they're trying to determine here. They have to compare it to others. And the assumption when the scientists did this, the working assumption when the scientists did this, was all of those that I mentioned earlier. Many of the scientists doing this work are actually affirming scientism, the idea that science is the best way to approach this question of the genetic relation between the chimpanzee and the human being. And so there are assumptions there like scientism, that science is the only or the best route to knowledge in this instance. Also, the assumption of methodological or metaphysical naturalism, that there cannot be any supernatural explanations or causes involved whatsoever, which simply begs the question. It assumes the very thing that needs to be proven. The scientists also imagine that their description, then, that's based upon these assumptions, is what is actually properly describing reality, that they've actually gotten through and broken into the fabric of reality itself in the actual genome, when remember, they only have a small sliver of the entire picture to begin with, and even that small sliver that they have is merely a snapshot that is based on these other projects with genomes. So, the assumption, in other words, that these scientists used is that there was a common ancestor between chimpanzees and human beings. Let me repeat that so that you understand what I'm saying. It's not as though the scientists looked at this hard data and it was brute facts, and they came away with the scientific understanding based on hard evidence that chimpanzees and human beings share a common ancestor. No, they started with the assumption that chimpanzees and human beings shared a common ancestor, then used the human genome as a mapping tool, as a framework to then build what they needed in terms of mapping out what's going on with chimpanzee genetics. This is what we would call begging the question, assuming the very thing that needs to be proven. So we want to show or demonstrate or evidence or prove that chimpanzees and human beings came from a common ancestor. But the evolutionary scientists just start with that assumption and then use the evidence in the lab to try to fill that in and then draw these evidences based on it. And so, yeah, if you start with the assumption there's a common ancestor, then you're going to draw these inferences that, in fact, chimps and humans, the genomes there look similar. So you get these numbers like, oh, there's a 98% similarity between chimp and human DNA. Well, even that on a finer level has been called into question. Most people would say 89% now, but there are studies out there that say that the genetics between the chimp and the human are at 85% similarity. Now, understand that when we're talking about genetics, that means there are hundreds of millions of differences between human DNA and chimpanzee DNA. When we say that we know these are similar, that human and chimpanzee DNA is 85% similar, what we're doing is basing that off of what scientists did, even apart from the reality that's behind it. This is what I was talking about earlier with the difference between evolution as a descriptive thing and what's actually happening in reality. In other words, we're making these claims, the evolutionists are making these claims based off the constructed genome that the scientists put together versus the actual genome. Now, of course, they have faith based on this assumption that I've already mentioned. They have faith based on this assumption that the constructed genome matches what's happening in actuality, but we don't have near the sample size or the evidence or the knowledge to actually come to that conclusion, apart from the assumption that's already there that's supposed to establish evolution, apart from these inferences that they're drawing that's supposed to establish evolution. Moreover, when we look more closely at the genetics that are involved, these genomes from the chimpanzee are actually, in many instances, we've learned, misassembled. Not only that, but they're oftentimes contaminated. Why would they be contaminated, and how are they contaminated? Well, scientists are doing this work in a lab, and the scientists happen to be human. It's not the chimpanzees who are doing the work on their own genome. It is human scientists, and there is room then for human error. And so what happens is there are DNA sequence databases that when we look at them more carefully, these sequence databases actually have significant levels of human DNA in them from the workers themselves. When you look at the earliest part of this project to map out and understand the chimpanzee genome, what you find are these contaminated results. The earlier, the more human DNA you found in the chimpanzee DNA, because there were errors there was contamination. And so then the inference that was drawn was, wow, look at all of these similarities between chimpanzee and human genetic material, when in fact it just came from the people working on it to begin with. You see that less and less as time goes on in the project, but that just proves the point here that we have misassembled and even contaminated genetic evidences, so-called, here. So let's talk about this as Christians. How exactly do we put all of this together? We've talked about the assumptions that are in play here. We're going to talk a little bit now about the inferences that are in play here. Let's say that God exists as we believe, and God has a mind. He is, in fact, a designer, an intelligent designer. Well, this intelligent designer, we believe, would actually have a common plan, as it were, or a common design for those creatures that he actually brings about in the world. And so when we look at, just like with fossil evidence, when we look at genetic evidence and we see these similarities between the two, and we're granting that there's some level of similarity, the natural inference need not be that evolution occurred and that there is common descent. We can say as Christians that in fact the similarities are accounted for in that we have a common designer who gave these two different living entities a common design, even though there are also vast differences between the two. Now, one of the stronger arguments for this common descent view is that there is scarring in the genetic material. So, for example, perhaps you'll look at chimpanzee genetic evidence and human genetic evidence, and you'll see that something supposedly infected them at some point, and they both have those same scarring in the genetic material, in the same place in the genetic material, pointing to the fact that at one point it actually infected a common ancestor. Something like that, we have to ask the question, is evolution the only or even the best explanation? Well, we're going to come to that in just a moment, but what we need to ask is a simple question like, how do we even differentiate between that supposed scar or scarring in genetic material and what we would see as functional design anyway? You see, for evolution to be the only or the best inference from the evidence we actually have, genetically speaking, even in terms of that scarring I just mentioned, or what some scientists have referred to as junk DNA, even when we look at that, to establish that evolution would be the only or the best inference, we have to have a few different things lined up. There's a man named Fuzrana who talks about this, and he says that there really are three things that must be the case for us to come only to the evolutionary explanation of this evidence. First of all all of this junk DNA, the scarring in the genetic record, as it were, that would have to be non-functional. If it is actually functional genetic material, then we don't really have an argument there, because it can be, for example, part of a design from an intelligent designer. And so you have to have non-functional sequences in the DNA and structures in the DNA to make the case that evolution and only evolution explains this evidence that's before us. Secondly, Rana says that we have to have it such that we cannot repeat this evidence, that it's just random, it just happened, it's happenstance, and that it's even rare. We don't actually find that, but we'll come to that in a moment. And then third, we have to see that in the genetic code here, these features that are shared between the humans and the chimpanzees, we have to see that they only come about through a vertical gene transfer, that they are limited to that cause of vertical genetic transfer. But what we actually find, and this goes way beyond Rana, what we actually find when we look at the genetic evidence, even in terms of this supposed scarring, even in terms of this supposed junk DNA, is that junk DNA, insofar as we can even determine what it does, why it's there, those sorts of things, it has a function. Even when we think, oh, we can't find a function, that doesn't mean that it doesn't have some function that we have not yet discovered. And so it has a function. It is very commonly found. It's not random at all. We can actually repeat instances of this. And we also see mechanisms that are in place for how this scarring can come about horizontally rather than just vertically. There is actual a mechanism here that can account for horizontal gene transfer, or rather would offer that explanation that there's horizontal gene transfer. There are actually hot spots that, going back to Rana, that he cites, hot spots in the genomes that have these alterations that they undergo that are not rare, they're not random. We can repeat it in the lab. We can see it there in the lab. He cites transposon insertions, intron insertions, and again, these occur at these hot spots that are found in the genomes. And so also you see, as he's already mentioned, these horizontal instances of gene transfer, and he cites here vector-mediated pathways as well as organelle capture. These can actually appear then in that record that we supposedly have. They can actually look like common descent, even though we know, just based on the evidence itself, that common descent had nothing to do with it, because it's not vertical, it's horizontal. It's on that level that these things take place in a repeatable, testable fashion. There's also human-specific scarring, by the way. We would expect that if humans did share a common ancestor, if there's common descent, along with the chimpanzees, we would expect there to be similarities all the way through, and that's simply not what we find. We find many different differences, even when it comes to this supposed scarring. So humans have their own specific scarring, and humans also have a lack of scarring. For example, human beings lack what is known as simian foamiviruses and simian infectious retroviruses. But when you look at primates, most primates actually carry these genetic sequences. Again, human beings do not. But we should expect to find them in human beings if, in fact, there is common descent there. Well, the most reasonable inference there would be that there's not common descent. Now, we do carry HIV, we do carry the human T leukemia virus, but we don't have any others other than that. So either something happened and we lost all that genetic evidence, which would actually undermine this evolutionary theory and the whole way we're able to draw the inferences and whatnot, or we never actually had them. And so it actually turns out in the end that the genetic evidence cuts against the common descent theory. And in fact, since the so-called junk DNA carries function with it, which is inherently based on design, this genetic evidence actually confirms, we believe, our belief in the intelligent designer who is God. So, in terms of creation, we have common functionality in our human DNA, and it does function similarly to other created beings because they are, in fact, created just like we are. And yet, human beings are unique. There is, yes, a common blueprint that's behind these things that comes from the archetype, comes from the mind of God himself. When we look at different processes in nature, be they physical or chemical or biological, we see that these things happen frequently, that it's not just all happenstance. We see that these things are reproducible, and we see that there are independent features from them in the organisms around us, different organisms in their genomes. But all of this just goes to show that we have a creator. Uh, the reason that there are differences in these genomes is because they are deliberately designed to do something different. We have different functions. And of course, there are changes that take place in nature. None of that cuts against the Christian account of these things at all. It doesn't oppose Christianity. Consider, for example, the fact that everything was good when God created it, and then the world, we had a fall into sin, the fall of man. Adam sinned against God. He transgressed God, and now the whole earth rests under this curse of sin. And so we anticipate that things do actually change over time. That doesn't prove anything like biological evolution in any sort of secular sense. None of this genetic evidence that's out there leads us to take the same assumptions as these secular scientists and those who follow them blindly, nor does it lead us to make these same inferences about the world around us. What we really find when we dig into the evolutionary evidence is that it's all a lot of distraction from the truth that God has created us, and thus God owns all life on this earth, and He alone has the authority and the power to command us how we are to live our lives to best please Him and serve Him and function as He wants us to function in the world. When we have sinned against Him, as we have, all have sinned and come short of the glory of God, that means that we're no longer on speaking terms with God. And so many people look for a justification for why they are against God. And one of the things that people have to do then, if they don't want to believe in God because they are sinners and they are accountable to God and they're facing a coming judgment, as I mentioned in an earlier episode on this podcast, I'd encourage you to go back and check that out. Have evolutionists indoctrinated you? One of the ways that people react to that suppression of the truth is they have to explain where all of the animals around us and human beings themselves came from. And so rather than turning to Christ Jesus, who came and lived a perfect life and died on the cross for our sins in our place and was raised again, just as Scripture teaches, the Creator Himself stepped into His creation to save those of us who have sinned against Him, who are facing the consequences of the curse of sin that rests on this world. When people reject that story, the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ, the true story that accounts for all of history and all of science and everything, they have to come up with a way to get around that through figuring out how everything is here, including themselves. That's why people make, just based on blind faith, this assumption that evolution is true. That's why they cite scientific consensus, even though they're not scientists themselves. That's why they draw these inferences, conflating the inferences with the evidences. And that's why they come to you and say, well, of course evolution is true. What a fool you are to reject it. The evidences all demonstrate this. Look at the fossils. Look at these molecular fossils. Look at the genetic evidences. But none of that follows whatsoever unless you already accept it in the first place. What we do actually have is DNA evidence for, you can call it a primordial type Adam and Eve. We have a genetic similarity between human beings that is unique, that is distinct from the rest of animals on Earth, but we'll have to save all of that information for another time. If you know someone who might be interested in today's topic or in future episodes, I hope that you'll go ahead right now and share this episode with them. Also, it would help if you would share this across your social media platforms, and of course, make sure to hit like and subscribe. Thanks again for listening to Christ or Chaos with Chris Bolt.